genes rare, and it's my pleasure to be moderating today's panel. We've got a great group of panelists today who have experience with the informed consent process and documents, and they're going to share with you their thoughts from their instant experiences. Our panelists today are John Wilbanks, Chief Commons Officer at Sage Bionetworks, Christy Clark, Vice President, Project Management and Clinical Operations for Agility Clinical, and Megan O'Boyle, Principal Investigator for the Phlan McDermott Syndrome Data Network. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd also like to thank today's sponsors, Alexion, Genzyme, and Shire for their support of today's webinar, and the staff of Global Genes, and in particular Amanda Nittner for her work putting together and coordinating today's program. This webinar is meant to be interactive. I encourage participants watching this live to use the instant messenger in the bottom right-hand corner of their screens to questions for the panel as we go along. I'll do my best to work them into the conversation or save them up for the end. We will try to have some time for audience questions at the end. Today we're discussing informed consent, what is, why it matters, and what you should know about it. We could start with John Wilbanks of Sage Bionetworks. John, perhaps you can take a minute to explain Sage Bionetworks, what it is, and its involvement in the informed consent process.
I thank Global Genes and everyone for the opportunity to speak. And I'll actually come back to these slides a little bit later, actually. I'll cut to them during the when we talk about consent as a process. I apologize, Amanda, I gave you the wrong info. So Sage Bionetworks is a nonprofit biomedical research institution based in Seattle. And our goal is to help transform clinical research to a world that is more open, more reproducible, lower cost, by creating standardized public infrastructure, by creating sort of end-to-end solutions for clinical studies that are open to groups of people who want to study themselves for whatever reason, including rare disease, and try and make it possible for a way of doing clinical research that doesn't depend as much on the institution of the existing clinical research system, because it can be very expensive and very confusing to try to engage with the systems. So we work on informed consent. In order to enroll people in the clinical studies that we're running and hosting, if we're going to enroll people through their telephones, which is the primary method that we're using, we're not going to have a chance for a person to explain an informed consent document.
Over the other side, kind of like...
As people go through enrollment, they actually understand the study and they are capable of providing informed consent with free will. So we spent about 2 years. Go ahead. Sorry.
Can I ask you to just take a step back here? And the consent process grows out of a historical context. Perhaps you can give us some of that background. What are the origins of the informed consent process? What concerns was it intended to address?
So consent is basically a way to get permission before we do things with people's health. And the idea is this is different than simple consent, which would be when you click OK on something on the internet. That's a form of simple consent. Informed consent is different because it's based on the idea that you need to understand the choice, to understand the risks, the benefits, enough that you can make an informed voluntary choice to either get a surgery or to have your data move around for payment or to enter into a clinical research study. And it's a concept it's actually a very old concept. I've got some documents that are, date back to the early 1900s. It goes back well before that. But in its modern form, it really comes out of post-Nuremberg, post-Tuskegee, late 70s, early 80s, when, because of a variety of reasons, governments around the world came together to say that if you were going to enroll people in clinical research, you had to obtain informed consent. And then what that has turned into is a process whereby someone who's enrolled or getting ready to perform a medical procedure on you, hand you a document. That document, in theory, contains everything you need to know. And in theory, that person explains the document to you, and then you get to choose yes or no what you'd like to do. So that's really where sort of consent comes from. And it's a little bit from the concern, trying to address the concern of people getting hoodwinked into a study. And it's kind of moved more to being frequently about liability and making sure that the institution that's running the work it has their butts covered from a liability perspective. And that change in the concerns that it's intended to address has made consent a lot harder than it used to be, and probably a lot harder than it needs to be.
So clinical trial is one example of where you would come up against an informed consent document, but what are the range of things where people are going to confront this in the realm of care? So
every time you change doctor's offices, you'll sign an informed consent document, at least in the United States, to authorize distribution of your data for payment purposes. Frequently, if you're going to have some sort of intervention, surgery, or a riskier kind of drug, you'll have a consent process in the document before that. And then obviously if you're enrolled in any sort of clinical study, whether it's observational or interventional. But those are sort of the three big ones, are movement of data for payment purposes, treatment purposes, and then study purposes. Typically.
I guess in terms of the rare disease community, data registries would also fall onto that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, we talk about, or tend to talk about, informed consent as a document, but it's really a process. How does the process work ideally?
So the way that's worked traditionally is that the researcher or the clinician or nurse practitioner or whoever's actually sitting with the patient ideally explains what's in the document, because these documents are written in a really difficult way. They're written by lawyers, and they're reviewed and edited by committees, and they look like that. So and as you're hearing my dog, so that's the traditional process. And then what we do at SAGE is try to take that part of more of a technology process. So if you want to pull the slides up, I can run through a couple and show some of the elements of that. If we could skip ahead to the slide that says screens are organized in consistent areas. Slides. Okay. So what we've done is to take the document and build an interface to it, because we're not going to have that process where a person talks about it. And the idea is that we should communicate. The process should be, whether you have a person or technology involved, the process should be to communicate the most important concepts in a very clear way. These are complicated concepts. They're often not concepts that the doctors are familiar with. So things like data processing, it's really important to know, study data will be combined with similar data from other participants. So we've laid that out in a visual way, and that feeds into a process. And so if you go ahead 2 slides to the integrate study-specific concepts, what you see is this is actually a story about the study that's a visual representation of an informed consent document. So this is the second way to do an informed consent process, as opposed to a one-to-one explanation process. If you are in a situation, if you're a parent of a kid with a rare disease, and you don't see an attempt to communicate these concepts in an accessible way, don't be afraid to say, stop, slow down, I need you to explain what's in this document.
Because I think in most cases, you're not getting these very user-friendly screens. You're actually getting a fairly dense document with medical language and legalese.
That's exactly right.
Let me ask you this. Each informed consent is going to be unique to a situation, but I take it they share common elements. What are the common elements that you'll find in any informed consent process?
So I think one of the reasons to have this screen up is it's a good example of those key elements. So we identified 8 key standard elements, and then there's customization inside of them. So first is welcome and any general issues with who's allowed to enroll or who's supposed to enroll in the study, so welcoming and enrollment. The section we call the research, so this should outline what the study's going to do, why they're going to do it. Section on your data. This is typically not present in most informed consent documents today. We think it needs to be, because as we move into a digital world with electronic medical records, where your data is going, who gets it, and what they get to do with it is something you need to know about. Impact on your life. These could be as pedestrian as this may affect your battery life if you're using a mobile phone for the study. all the way up to, people might discover you're in a study. And so if you have perhaps Parkinson's disease, that's not a big deal. But if you have genital herpes, you might not want people to know you're in the study. What is involved? So this would be the actual potatoes of the study. What kinds of questions are we going to ask you? What kinds of data are we going to gather? Why? Question on your rights. Free will. A piece of informed consent is the idea that you literally have the right to be a volunteer, and the minute you decide you don't feel like being a volunteer, you can get out. So that's a key piece. Obviously, risks and benefits are the traditional process is focused in many cases. And then we have the whole, do we assess comprehension? So ideally, this would be where the nurse or the clinician would ask you, do you understand what you're getting into? In our world, we run little exams and tests. Then you review the underlying document and give an unambiguous signature for consent.
How would you say informed consent has evolved over time? Is it I would say in some ways it seems like it's getting denser and more difficult, and in other ways it seems to be improving, like what you're showing on the screen right now. It's structurally it's evolved in a way where it was created really to protect people, to that they weren't getting treated or studied when they didn't understand or consent to it. And it continues to do that, but it has evolved in a negative way in institutions as an attempt to limit liability, which makes sense. That's what institutions do. They exist to minimize their risk in many cases. And so that has been a negative piece of its evolution, is because when you start to add, 4 pages of definitions and liability limitations, you obscure the key study concepts in a way that disables informedness. On the good side, we think some of these concepts like visual consent, pictographic consent, video consent, even having a game where the winner of the game is achieving informed consent, those are really interesting evolutions that sort of address the informedness problem in consent. And then the other piece of evolution that's happening is if you look here, thinking of your data. We didn't used to have to worry about talking about data and where the data goes in informed consent, because the data were going to be on paper, they were going to go into a file cabinet, and it wouldn't get shared. So that evolution, I think that's going to be the biggest one. And there's going to be a lot of different ways to interface and make it more understandable, but this concept that part of the deal of signing up is knowing where your data is going and having some control over that, I think that's going to be the most disruptive evolution over the next couple of years. So overall, how good a process would you say we're doing with informed consent? Is it serving patients and doing what it's supposed to do as far as letting them know what they're getting into?
It depends. If you've got the right person takes informed consent seriously, then the process can work really well. And give an example from last week. I was with my dad in the hospital, and his nurse did assess, did he have comprehension, explained the options, let him make a choice. There was no document involved. The process was exactly what informed consent is supposed to achieve. And so the part of the problem we have right now is that the amount of time that anyone has with a doctor or a clinician or a nurse is limited. The doctor, the nurse, the clinician doesn't usually have time to analyze the document and think about what needs to be communicated. And so I think the average process is failing us. Just as the good implementation of the process is wonderful, the average implementation of the process is typically a failure. It's like an in-person version of the way that we click OK on the internet on terms of use for iTunes. And so that's really why we got into this at SAGE, was that we wanted to intervene in informed consent. Whether our solution is the right one or not, and it's all free open source because we're a nonprofit, we want to open up the conversation, saying there's different ways of conveying these concepts, and that doing that actually will help the clinician just as it's going to help the patient.
Well, I'll remind our audience that they can instant message questions in the Q&A box in the lower corner of their screen. I'll do my best to pose them to panelists as we go, or save them up for the end. Christy Clark in here. Christy is the Vice President of Project Management and Clinical Operations for Agility Clinical. Christy, you work for a variety of biomedical companies and contract research organizations. You've been involved in creating these documents. what's the process when an informed consent document needs to be created?
So we typically, you start with the protocol for the clinical trial, and, we typically work with
Maybe you should take a minute and just explain what the protocol is for people who may not be familiar.
Yep, just a little bit. So a clinical research organization is hired by your biotech or sponsor for clinical trials, and what we do is we may write the protocol, we'll run the clinical trial, and so the protocol outlines all of the procedures and all of the different analyses that will go into the clinical trial. So when the informed consent is created, we typically start with all of the procedures that they will need to undergo during the course of the clinical trial, the timing of it, and what they'll need to do. And typically, the whole point of the informed consent is to protect the patient, to inform them what risks there are, what benefits there may be, and what kind of samples will be taken, how much of those samples. So if you're having, a tablespoon of blood taken, for example, the language in the informed consent is very important because it should be written at a 5th grade level. So typically we start with that protocol and then we move through the process of outlining the risks and the benefits and really in mind of protecting that patient.
As you're writing it, what are you thinking in terms of your ultimate goals with the document?
I want it to be really clear so that it's very, easy for a study coordinator, who is the person who's working with the physician, to explain the process to the patient, to explain exactly what they're going to be doing, and also to let them know that they can withdraw their consent at any time. So really the goal is to have language that's understandable for that particular patient.
And when you're doing this document from the point you start with protocol to the point it's finalized, who has input into the document and who ultimately approves it?
That's a really good question. So typically we start, with that protocol. So that's a sponsor-initiated effort along with us. We write quite a few protocols for our clients. And from there, the informed consent, along with the protocol, needs to be approved by an ethics committee or institutional review board, an IRB. And they'll really look at that protocol and determine if the patient's safety is going to be maintained. And if they see any issues, and sometimes they will with pediatric trials, for example, especially in rare disorders when, there are only pediatric patients in a particular rare disease. You start with the older children if they're available, and then you move down into the age group. So those 3 entities are really critical in making sure that that patient's protected. However, I know that this was brought up a little bit earlier by John, and that is that legalese that's coming into these documents. And I think it's important to know that a lawyer is not typically looking at these informed consents. However, there are many guidance documents and like ICH guidelines and E6 in Europe that already outline the law. And to the letter of that law, we are bound to protect those patients, and we have to follow those guidelines specifically.
Well, when points of concern do come up, what are typically the types of things that get raised?
It could be, that the drug, for example, hasn't been utilized or tested in a certain patient population, such as, children from the age of 1 to 10, for example. We see IRBs push back and say, no, we'd like to see this in adults. And I will say that sometimes that's challenging. In some of the rare diseases that we work in, there may not be an adult population. So it's really critical also to, have medical background and to have advisors that can answer the questions that these IRBs or ethics committees may have about the clinical trial.
Well, I don't know if you want to chime in here, but I take it there are different concerns about the documents. There is the concern about patients' needs, being clear about what they're taking on in terms of risk and benefits, but as are concerned about their legal liabilities. While lawyers do figure into the process, and does this end up being any kind of a competing interest?
It certainly can be. This is one of the reasons why we've taken the approach at Sage of not trying to simplify the consent form, although that's certainly an important thing. It's anticipated in all sorts of federal policy that's come out in the last couple of weeks. But on saying what are the most important parts of the document? Because you're not going to enroll or unenroll in a study based on the liability clauses that the lawyers inserted. And so where we are right now is that the lawyers often have the final say, and that means that they're going to, exercise as much control on behalf of their clients as they can. So the lawyers wind up adding language that obscures the underlying issues for very explainable local reasons. And that's why it's so important to demand and ask questions of the clinician and say, what do I really need to know that's in this document, because I can't read it.
I know that people friend and family who know what you do to you and ask you for your advice and expertise in reading this document. I'm curious about the types of questions you get and what advice you give people about how they should approach the informed consent document.
You're right. I do have quite a few friends that come to me or friends of friends. And, for example, recently I had a friend come to me with a GM trial, a glioblastoma. And one of the questions that she had on behalf of her brother was, if we do this trial, which is sort of cutting edge, can we stop at any time, and will it prohibit us from moving on to other trials that may benefit him more as we move through the treatment process and modalities? And, the answer is yes, you can stop any time, but you do need to refer to the informed consent to see how long, you might need to wait before you go on another trial. So typically that's 30 days. So that's one area. The other area that we get questioned on is, we work with sponsors that are doing gene testing to ensure that the appropriate patients are being enrolled. And that gene testing is actually quite a positive thing for a lot of patients and their families. They want to know what their children or their loved ones have. However, it's important to think about what happens with that data. Is it being reported somewhere? Is it going to be utilized down the road? Or, if more technology becomes available, can we get that data so that it can be rerun through that new technology? Also, within regard to samples, I've seen some hesitancy from patients in regard to, for example, if they have a skin biopsy, which is really quite painful, and that tissue is stored, and now in the informed consent, you need to look to see who owns that tissue sample. Typically, it's the sponsor. So if you have a child who's had a skin biopsy and you want just a piece of that in order to run some new testing, you may not have access to that sample, and that's really important to ask your investigator or your physician before you enroll in these types of studies.
Are there things people can actually negotiate, or is that a document that's set in stone and they're going to have a policy, no, we're not sharing this with the patient?
That's a really good question. I think what happens on clinical trials is we get feedback from investigators on why people don't want to enroll. So, for example, if that's a big sticking point for patients, they want to have access to their tissue samples or their data or whatever. We get that information and we provide it to the sponsor and say, you've lost 20 patients in a very rare disorder because you are holding their data. Is this something that you're willing to negotiate on? And then we can do protocol amendments and such, or changes to the informed consent form through the IRB to make those changes for the patient. So we have seen that happen.
In the rare disease community, people are often desperate for having to do anything, to do something that, I think there's a tendency maybe to gloss over the informed consent process in terms of risk and benefits just because, the downside may seem so minimal. But, I wonder if you wouldn't minute and just talk about your experience with your stepmom.
So this is a good example of, my stepbrother really wanted my stepmom to be treated for a melanoma that she had that had metastasized. And she was really fortunate and lived her 10 years when she was given a 6-month prognosis for her life. And so I had promised her early in the process that if she wanted me to review informed consents for clinical trials, I would do it from a very objective standpoint. And towards the end of her life, her son really wanted her to go on this new clinical trial. And so she sent it to me, and I reviewed it. And basically, it was she had the opportunity to extend her life by a week or so. However, there was very high toxicity with this particular product, investigational product. And so really, I didn't advise her so much as what to do, but I did let her know, these are the benefits. It will extend your life by a week, and these are the risks. And you need to kind of, decide what's right for you. And she decided not to do the trial because of that, having that sounding board of what are your risks and benefits. And, I think her son was a little upset with me, but really those things are important. And that's what your investigator and your study coordinator should be doing, and sitting down with your patients and telling them, here's your risks and here's your benefits.
Well, once again, I want to remind our audience that they can instant message questions that you may have for our panelists as we go, and we'll try to work them into the conversation or set up for the end. Let's turn to Megan O'Boyle, Principal Investigator for the Phlan-McDermott Syndrome Data Network. Megan, perhaps you can begin by explaining what Phlan-McDermott Syndrome is and what the Foundation does and your role with the organization.
And thanks for inviting me today. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So McDermott syndrome is a very rare genetic syndrome associated with the 22nd chromosome. There's generally a mutation or deletion at the end of the chromosome, and consequently it causes intellectual disabilities, often autism and epilepsy and a myriad of other medical conditions. If you were to meet my daughter at Target, you would say there's a teenage girl who's nonverbal and clearly has some behavior issues. She seems autistic, and you would be right on all counts. So it presents similarly to other rare genetic causes of autism and intellectual disabilities. Some people have heard of Fragile X or Angelman or Rett. So kind of in that pool of rare causes of autism. The Foundation is a volunteer-run organization of parents who came together originally for family support, to have a meeting every 2 years to be there for each other and explain things. Eventually, about 6 years ago, research became more of a focus. As the technology increased, genetic testing became less expensive. And about 5 years ago, one of the parents who was heading up the research really said, this is the time where we need to collect data. We're going to do a registry. Most of us had never heard of a registry. We knew what a database was, but we didn't know what a registry was. And so that's how the Foundation launched its own registry. Often registries are launched from an individual researcher, a doctor, or an institution. So this was a unique idea, which has much more common. And the benefit is that we can disseminate the data that we collect from our families in these questionnaires to researchers around the world. So it's great to have data out of silos and in a more common area.
And the fact that you were getting involved in creating a registry, did this bring you to the point of the informed consent process from the other side?
It did. I'd seen informed consents in various different shapes and forms all my life, and I'm sure I probably read very few of them from start to finish. I thought that they were a formality. When I got involved with this, I realized that this was a low-risk research project. We were asking parents of children with rare syndrome to voluntarily answer questions that they could skip or answer, and that they drop out from the registry anytime. So this was not a medically invasive procedure. It was not life-threatening. So my assumption was that we could keep it simple. I had the benefit of learning about registries from the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community. I believe it was a 6-statement consent, and I believe stole it. Put our name where it said Duchenne, and that was our starting point. Our consent is 8 statements now, but there's background information for families.
I want to get back to that, but your dad was an oncologist, I believe, and that you've him as a bioethicist by default. How did he inform your view of the informed consent process?
Well, he's in his late 80s, and he was involved in oncology when there was very few good prognoses, and so he got very involved in end of life and decisions about end of life, and that's how he entered into bioethics. And when I explained to him that I was getting more involved with research in this foundation, he said two things. Don't be one of those crazy patient groups. So I took some offense, but now I understand what he means. And he said, if the project has an informed consent, keep it short, keep it simple, and don't confuse people. And
if I'm not mistaken, he also advised you that the lawyers shouldn't write them. Why did he say that?
He has sent me copious articles about this and has informed me. One of the articles, I believe, said that for every year that informed consent has existed, the average length of informed consent has increased by a full page. I can't tell where that document is, but that sounds about right to me. John might be able to tell us historically if that's correct. But his point was, lawyers speak. That's not a 5th grade or 6th grade level. It's not simple. It's repetitive, which gets confusing, and it gets onerous, and people don't read it. And, you know, there's a very important word in this whole webinar, and it's the word informed. If you skip the end and sign something, then you're not informed. And, you know, I would beg that anybody on this webinar has truly been informed on the, you know, iTunes term of agreement that we've all clicked accept on. But, you know, what is our risk there? So it was ingrained in my head by him and others and some of the research that I did that it really was not to the benefit of the patient who have a lot of legalese, that you should keep it simple, and there should always be, as John pointed out in the 8 components, there should be an opportunity for the patient or participant to go back to a source and ask questions, whether it's on a website or in phone or in person, depending on the degree of risk. You know, you're not necessarily going to click I agree to a major brain surgery on an iPhone, but, you know, you'll have somebody there explaining it to you in person.
So I don't know whether these documents have grown at a rate of 1 page per year, but I think people in general would say that they have gotten longer and longer. What's the consequence of that?
People read them. I think that people may get scared by what they read because there's so many things that are not likely to occur that have to be included because the legal department says we need to cover everything. So, I've never been involved with a clinical trial, but Christy can probably speak to this. There is probably risks that are listed in clinical trial form consents that are just so far out of the likelihood of happening, yet listed, and they're scary, and it deter people from getting involved. In our case, we're talking about, you know, like I said, volunteers in a registry. So the greatest risk, as John said earlier, was making sure people understood that data can only be so secure, and you know what could happen to the data.
So not a high-risk participation, but you have an informed consent form that's 8 paragraphs, I think you said? Right?
Yeah, statements, correct.
So how were you able to get it so amicably and still comply with the requirements of an informed consent document?
Well, the ID that we have had no problem with it, so you know, we've done what we were told to do. We do have what's called Understanding My Participation, and it's a document that's paired with the informed consent in a FAQ format. So it has very simple questions. It's also written at a 6th grade level, and it is questions like registry, when to quit, where to go. And so if people want more detail than they got from the 8 statements in the informed consent, then they have a very simple document to look at.
So you mentioned earlier that your daughter has Phlan McDermott syndrome. Getting care for her, I think you had mentioned to me that you'd get care from 16 providers in 15 years and hundreds of consent documents. What's been your experience as a medical consumer? How carefully have you read those documents?
I think I've always had very responsible providers who have done what they needed to do and offered me ample time. But the bottom line is my daughter is non-compliant, PhD, 10th degree. and we are often in situations that are precarious, and I need to get going. So, no, I don't read a 10-page informed consent. I flip through it, I see what needs to be initialed, and I sign the end. Because more often than not, I've volunteered to be part of the study, or I've sought out this physician for a specific reason. And common sense-wise, know that everything in life comes with some risk, and I'm undertaking it. I'm not involved in clinical trials. I think if I were filing a drug, I would ask for advance consent that I could read at my leisure when my daughter's not with me. But when you're at an admissions desk in a hospital and, you know, the patient is trying to escape, you're going to have an informed consent experience that's going to be comprehensive.
So I know you've used the term the iTunes effect. You were alluding to this a moment ago, but what do you mean by the iTunes effect?
I refer to it as well, is where you just skip to the end and say, I agree. And, you know, that's not informed. I think a better way of it is to have something that summarizes it in a succinct way. If you don't understand it, then you have a way to get your questions answered.
So you offered me an example of a Stanford University researcher who went through great pains to put families in your community through the informed consent process. He was very thorough, but I'm wondering if you can provide the patient perspective on this and why it made you angry.
I was more frustrated than angry, and it was because I understood why he did what he did. He had an IRB that he needed to comply with, and he was very kind to come all the way to our family conference to oversee this collection. And Christy mentioned earlier, it was a skin biopsy, so it was skin patches from children's arms, very tiny, like the end of a pencil, and also blood draws from the child, and all of this was also done to the parents. And so we knew that doing that between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. The family conference was going to be a little crazy, so we did the informed consent by email in advance. Before the biosample collection, we had a meeting at a conference room at the hotel to walk people through and offer questions and answers. But out of fear of an IRB review and that, I would say, culture of fear of IRBs, the researcher is going through every single page of the 56-page informed consent with each family as they came into the villa for their mission. The point of that is they were with children, just like my daughter, who were wiry and trying to escape and had not eaten yet and wanted to go swimming in the pool that they had walked by. And meanwhile, these parents have had to listen to basically a huge document be read out loud to them, which what they were willing to sign when they walked in an hour previously. And it left a bad experience in many of our patients. They wouldn't be likely to do it again. If there was one complaint, it wasn't about the skin biopsy or, you know, the fasting or anything else. It was, you know, that hour of going over the informed consent. And it was invasive. It was not like a registry. So I understood where he was coming from. But I think that there's got to be better ways of doing it.
So we do have some questions coming in, and I'll throw this out to any of our panelists who might be able to answer it. But for multiple centers that collect patient data for registries or clinical trials, does each institution require its own informed consent, or is it possible to create a single informed consent that covers all institutions?
Christy, I can answer that if you'd like.
Please.
You can create a template informed consent, but each institutional review board will review it, and they may make their own changes.
And just for another listener, this is being recorded, and it will be available on the Global Genes website, and you can contact Global Genes about questions about use of it. I do want to remind our audience that they can instant message questions they have for many of our panelists, and we'll try to work them into the conversation as best we can or save them till the end. We've talked about informed consent from the point of view of the individual patient, but this has consequences for patient advocacy groups and patient populations at large. That's because the informed consent documents in the case of research and registries usually spell out what can be done with a participant's data. John, I'm wondering if you could speak to this. Why should this be an issue of concern to patient groups?
Basically, the case do things on a secondary nature with the data that used to be essentially impossible. And the data would be gathered on paper and put into literally put into a filing cabinet. If the data that are being created are useful in one context, they're also going to be useful in another context. In particular, the ability of groups of people with rare disease or who care about rare disease, the ability to begin combining diseases with similar phenotypes into secondary studies that basically are riding on the backs of the original studies. So if you have the right to get a copy of your own data as an individual, that's a really important benefit of being in a study versus a study that wouldn't give you a copy of your data back. SAGE, we do that, for example, and then we also let people donate a copy of their data to science as they go. What we're finding when we talk to patient groups is they want that data to go to more than one place. They don't just want to give it to one investigator and hope that she or he with a paper on it 2 years from now. They want to be able to move that data to data scientists for secondary reuse. They'd like to build longitudinal data profiles of themselves. Asking that question can be a pretty important piece of being an activated patient going through consent.
I apologize to our participants. I seem to have done something stupid here and limited my access to the Q&A box. So if you do have questions, please use the chat function and send it directly via the chat function. I apologize. One of the things we've talked about is what can be done for patient advocacy groups to negotiate changes to an informed consent document once it's complete.
Yeah, it's really hard to do. So these documents are created through a collective process where when especially in a research context, as you are writing a clinical protocol that describes how the study is going to work, the consent document gets written, it gets approved by an independent review board, an ethical committee. And so by the time it gets to you and is presented saying, sign this or don't sign this, it's not a negotiable document anymore. So in a lot of cases, what is most important is to try to find a way to get involved with the design of the study before it launches, because that's where you change the consent document, that's where you can negotiate some of the terms of the study to be those that fit your needs.
Okay, and your moderator has restored his Q&A box, so feel free to use that. Apologize. One of our participants sent in a question about has the advocacy organizations changed the informed consent process within their communities, and what do they need to do to create a more involved and stronger voice? Any thoughts on that?
We work with quite a few patient advocacy groups, and one of the things that we do before finalizing protocols whenever possible is to actually involve that advocacy group in the review. And we'll ask them if this type of, are there too many questionnaires? Do this type of medical procedures throughout the protocol, do they seem to make sense for this patient population? Many times they're very sick, they can't travel, so we'll send nurses to the home, for example. They may suggest that type of thing. So if they get involved in that protocol in the beginning, that affects your informed consent. And they can also ask about things about, data, where does it go afterwards, can it be shared? Many times the sponsors don't want to share their data because they're trying to move things forward and get approvals for their products. So it's a very sticky situation. So I would say that it is good to involve those advocacy groups because they can really push for those types of things.
So another question from a participant, I don't know if anyone here could speak to this, but they're wondering if anyone has suggestions for terms they want to participate in many studies over the years. Is there a good way for them to get their data from many doctors so they can send it for trials without having to request it from each one each time?
this is Christine, and I'm not sure if John or Megan want to answer this, but to me, there's really two questions there. And the first is, it's best if you own your data. So, for example, we're doing chart reviews now where we're actually collecting patients' medical records on their behalf. So we created an informed consent that they sign, and we're getting all of their medical records and housing them. And it's a lot for a particular patient in the disease group. And then we get another informed consent to enter their data. So I think the best way for that particular patient to do that is to gather all their medical records and keep them electronically themselves if they can do it at all possible. So even if you get paper data, take them in and get them scanned in and get everything held electronically so that you can present the data for different trials that you're enrolling in.
Well,
actually, our foundation is in the midst of doing this right now with 100 families. We are trying to collect all the medical records for U.S. families to have them be identified and entered into a database to be used by researchers around the world. And the part is not de-identifying, thousands and millions of pages of clinical notes from several different, hundreds of providers. The problem is each patient getting their records from the providers. And so we've had to employ a third party. There's several of them out there. They're growing. One is CareSync, one is Picnic Health. There's a few others, I think, that pay to go get all your records. You sign your waivers, and they go then fight the fight with your doctors and your labs and your hospitals and your clinics. And then once you get them, they're scanned and they're put in one account. And then I can share them as a patient with anybody I want to going forward. That seems insane to me in 2015 after the billions of dollars that were spent on electronic health records. But it's a reality, and we've been through. But up until that point, what parents like I did was every time I left somewhere, I asked for a copy and walked around with a ginormous 3-ring binder. And every time I went to a doctor, I'd pull out the crazy lady binder and I'd say, "Hi, what is it that you want to know?" And so I think Christy's suggestion is great. When you can get it, scan it, keep it, organize it, because the system is not working.
These are your views on how drug makers or researchers view patient groups, particularly in the case of rare diseases. Are they seen as important allies to court, and how valuable a connection or conduit to patients are they viewed as?
We work with our clients to work with patient advocacy groups very, very closely because that relationship is very, very important. So for our clientele, we really suggest that they involve that patient group from the beginning. We find it to be very important.
Well, is this a point of leverage groups have in terms of getting involved in crafting informed consent documents to assure data from the studies have the biggest impact?
Yes, and really what they want to do is influence that protocol because really your informed consent is sort of a reflection of that protocol. So yes, it is really important for them to get involved, and that's how they can help craft that informed consent.
John, do you have any advice for groups on how to leverage their roles with researchers or drug companies?
Well, the reality is that clinical recruitment is one of the hardest parts of clinical study, and patient groups have leverage in the ability to exert either help or to not help in recruitment. And so to the extent that it's possible, I think getting involved at the protocol design level and saying these are the things that matter, right? We're not going to get involved in negotiating, line-by-line edits to the document. But, with these 5 things need to be present, and if so, then we'll help recruit, then we'll participate, and we'll stay engaged. And that's a really pretty powerful, that's a bit of leverage that hasn't been used enough in my opinion.
As a representative of a patient group, I would say that we are, I'm thrilled to hear Christy say it, and I think a lot of tech and pharma groups have somebody called a patient engagement officer. But I do think that we are underutilized, and not our foundation, but groups in general. But I also think that there's been some history of some groups being difficult to work with, and I think that patients and patient representatives need to understand what the companies are up against in terms of regulations, what researchers are up against, and work with them as partners and not try and boss them around and do things their way. Everybody needs to be respectful of everybody's role. So I think
I hear your dad speaking right now.
But, I think that we're invaluable, and, we want to help, especially, I think our group is rare and pediatric. You don't get people that are more excited. We did that biosample collection. We ran out of skin punch kits. We had to turn people away from giving us skin because we didn't have any more kits to collect it. And, that speaks to what families are willing to do for research. So I think that checking each, and as John had brought up, returning data is invaluable. Our registry returns aggregated data on the spot. You answer 100 questions, you get to see where your answers fall against the other people that answered the questions. And in my mind, that's more valuable than anything.
At the same time, researchers and patient groups may not only have different interest in how data is used, but types of questions that are being answered. Is this also an opportunity for groups to make sure research questions are relevant to patients? They're seeking answers to questions that are meaningful to patients?
I think it goes both ways. When we did our registry, we ran our questions. We, collected questions, and then we ran them by researchers. If they were cardiac questions, we ran them by cardiac researchers and said, will these questions yield the data you're looking for? We're having researchers come to our family conference, and they're going to sit at tables with families. Families are going to say, you may think we want a treatment for seizures, but what we really want is a treatment for the fact that our children don't feel pain. That's actually more important. I'm just giving these as examples that we asked for researchers' input so that we collected the data that they would want to use. But we want them to listen to us about what's important to us in terms of research. Research shouldn't be done just because you think you can publish something. There's some application at the end.
I second what Megan is saying, and this is something that we're working on now with some of our patient advocacy groups. Is it's really important to do a chart review and look back to see all of the data that needs to be collected or the data that's common to all of these patients, but also to move forward and do natural history studies so you can see the disease progression and look for potential endpoints for clinical trials. Additionally, really important that Megan just mentioned is we call and talk to families about, okay, what's important to you? Because that's something the FDA is looking for. They don't care if you have a decreased count in whatever, if the patient is experiencing a benefit, it doesn't matter. So we'll call and find out what is important to a patient. Is it the sleep? Because they're having nighttime seizures or nighttime, issues, are they not sleeping? The family's not sleeping. And all of these things are super important.
Well, we're short on time, and I do want to save some time for questions from the audience. If you're a participant and you do have questions, there's still time to send them in via the Q&A box in the lower corner of your screen. As a last thought from each of you, what advice would you offer for improving the informed consent process? Let's start with John, who I lost. Maybe we'll start with...
I'm here. Got me?
John, go ahead.
You might
there you go.
I mean, the biggest thing that I would change is that we don't as a rule, we don't assess whether or not someone understood the process, whatever the process might be, whether it's a traditional process or some of the newer stuff like we do at Sage. And I'd like us to sort of think the idea that we should be actually figuring out whether or not someone understood. We should have, for when we make a consent form, we should make up a couple of questions that someone who's been through a consent process ought to be able to answer correctly. That's the number one thing that I would try to encourage people to take away is, and if that isn't, if you don't have something like that, that every participant should, at the moment of being presented with the form, told what essential pieces of this document.
What about you?
So a couple of things that kind of hit home, and this comes from Megan's statement that, there was a 56-page informed consent and it took an hour. We really try to keep our informed consents anywhere from 3 to 10 pages if possible. That's about as long as anyone's going to sit around. And additionally, also telling you what risks are real, like your physician should be able to tell you, this only happened in less than 1% of the population, going through and really highlighting the key areas and then letting the patient digest the informed consent and come back with questions. And if the patient doesn't have questions or the parent, the city coordinators should be encouraged to make sure they do understand, okay, you understand you have to come back for these, or you can withdraw at any time. I think that's really important. Additionally, I think knowing that there are different options, such as video-informed consents for vulnerable populations, you can do translations, you should have a translator there. So I think all of these things need to come into account.
Well, we'll turn to questions from our audience in the few minutes we have left. If you have questions, once again, you can try to send them in through the Q&A box right now in the lower corner of your screen. There's a question here about the pros and cons of static consents versus dynamic consents. Maybe someone could take a minute and just explain the difference between a dynamic consent and a static consent.
Christy, do you want to take that, or I'm happy to? It's up to you.
I'll take that.
Sure. So consent is a phrase that's been in play a lot lately. It typically means that the participant is able to adjust the terms of their consent on the fly. That's what it means by dynamic versus static. That can be pretty hard, especially if you are talking about studies that are doing computational modeling, because by removing people's data from the study after they change their mind, you actually can break the predictions that the model has made in the past. What we do at SAGE is sort of quasi-dynamic. Obviously, people can leave the study whenever they want. We won't collect any data going forward, but we don't make it possible to go back retroactively and delete data that's already been distributed. That tends to be pretty hard to do.
Are there pros to
the pro to dynamic consent is it gives more autonomy to the individual, which is one of the foundations of consent, is sort of individual voluntariness and autonomy. But we need to balance that with the benefit of the research, and so trying to find that balance in the sweet spot is the hard part. There has been some fantastic work on dynamic permissioning by the Genetic Alliance through their peer platform. That's not as much for a clinical research study. That's more like for registries, and that's a place where dynamic consent can work really well, I think. It doesn't fit as well with a research study as it does with some of the other registry kinds of activities.
Go ahead.
This is Megan. We have in our registry a yes/no. Are you willing to share your data with other databases? And if you say no, that's fine. Do you want to be recontacted every year? You can still say no. So it's more of a yes/no. One way I look at having too many choices is going and having, you could go to school cafeteria and get whatever the deal is for Tuesday, or you can go to a restaurant that has a 30-page menu. I want something in between. I want a choice, but I don't want to be overwhelmed. And I think that's what you have to think of when you're talking about all these different questions about permission. It can be overwhelming for the participant, especially if they're new to this type of format.
For one last question here, how to handle European concerns about data storage and use?
Yes, it comes up in clinical trials, and typically we just have to show that data is de-identified, and it'll be used in analysis, it'll cross the pond for analysis, but we're not distributing it anywhere else. So we just need to make sure that we're following the guidelines that are set forth by the European guidelines.
And are those more stringent than the U.S. guidelines?
Yes, this time, in my opinion, they are.
I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights today. John Wilbanks, Chief Commons Officer, Sage Bionetworks, Christy Clark, Vice President in Project Management and Operations for Agility Clinical, and Megan O'Boyle, Principal Investigator for the McDermott Syndrome Data Network. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd also like to thank today's sponsors, Alexion, Genzyme, and Shire for their support for today's webinar, staff of Global Genes, and Amanda Kittner for her work in putting together and coordinating today's program. Join us for our next webinar. You could check the Global Genes schedule and see it online there at globalgenes.org. I hope you'll join me every week for our Rarecast podcast, which you can find on Global Genes Rare Daily or on SoundCloud, iTunes, or Stitcher. You can continue the conversation with us by following us on Twitter. I'm at Diaz-Levine, and Global Genes is at Global Genes. As you seek to learn more about rare disease and connect with others, I encourage you to explore the many resources available on the Global Genes website. On behalf of Global Genes, I'm Daniel Levine. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar.